Hi, folks. So we're going to pick up the story of Greek ethics with Aristotle, and we're going to consider the sections initially from the so-called Nicomachean Ethics. It's called the Nicomachean Ethics because it's supposedly dedicated to Nicomedes. And there is another ethics that is attributed, a text ethics, that's attributed to Aristotle, but that's largely considered to be spurious. So it's considered to be, albeit an ancient one, but essentially a forgery that has some interesting material in it, but it's not. When people refer to Aristotle's ethics, they're referring to this text, the Nicomachean Ethics. So I'd like to say a couple of things initially, more generally about Aristotle, about his background, and then we can dive in and start to look at his ethical theory. So we're going to sort of consider here the focus point being on virtue. I've already touched on this before in the previous video, but I'd like to obviously enlarge on that in this specific context. As a subtitle here, I'm providing the rubric or the idea of morality as practical human excellence. There's a couple of things going on there. In the first book, or what we would more naturally call the first chapter of Aristotle's Ethics, he launches into a dispute essentially with Plato. You may recall that when I was introducing Socrates and I was discussing the reconstruction of Socrates and the presentation of Socrates' teaching through Plato's dialogues, I mentioned the idea that that cropped up again and again in the Socratic dialogues written by Plato. The idea that unless somebody can give an account of why they do what they do, then they can't be seen as truly enlightened and to that extent truly moral. So in other words, it's not enough to do the good thing, the right thing. The agent has to be able to account for why they do what they do. So in meta-ethical terms, that means that the agent needs to know or be directed by knowledge of the good. And that is a necessary condition for doing good. At first glance, that seems counterintuitive. One of the ways in which Aristotle tackles that in his ethics is to talk about the phenomenon of weakness of will, in Greek akrasia, or sort of weakness, if you like, in the sense of powerlessness, from kratos, meaning power, as in demokratia, power of the people. The idea of weakness of will is sort of an elaboration from Aristotle of his argument against Plato. That is to say, if we suppose, as Plato seems to do in many dialogues, that knowing why I'm doing something is a necessary condition for the goodness of the thing that I do, then if I can point to a case where somebody knows what the best thing to do is, but doesn't do it, that raises a question as to the efficacy of moral knowledge. And that's exactly what so-called weakness of will is meant to point out. And the idea of weakness of will put forward by Aristotle has an immediate intuitive attractiveness to it, in the sense that it doesn't seem difficult to suppose that someone could know what the right thing to do was, but not do it. So let's suppose, for example, that someone is abusing a substance of some kind, whatever that might be. Now, they might suppose that, they need to stop that. And they might suppose, and they might know why they need to stop that. because of the adverse impact it's having on their life and perhaps the people around them and so forth, that it makes them moody and irritable and so on and so forth. Now, they might have read about the adverse impacts of addiction. They might have been told about this, and they may be genuinely knowledgeable about the lack of self-interest in continuing to be actively addictive, but they nevertheless continue to do that. And of course, one could say, well, they're compelled to do that. That's what addiction is, and so on and so forth. But it would still indicate that knowledge alone is not enough, is not the basis on which somebody does good. And then further suppose that knowledge of the good is not only not sufficient, but that it's not necessary. And that also arguably has some intuitive attractiveness to it, in the sense that somebody might have be able to give no account as to why they do what they do, but they may nevertheless be doing the right thing. So this opens up something of a paradox in the sense that if we think that moral theory or moral teaching is what is needed to make people good, then obviously that sides more with the Platonic perspective. And the mission, if you like, of moral theory is to make people good. And that's something that Aristotle, in the first book, the Nicomachean Ethics, is essentially arguing against. It's not knowledge that makes people good, it's good action that makes people good. Now, Aristotle, the first book of Nicomachean Ethics, is really what contemporary philosophers would call meta-ethics. So it's the theory about the theories of ethics, hence the critique of Plato. And what Aristotle seems to be doing, and he does this typically in many of his treatises, in fact, almost invariably, is he looks at the existing theories and offers an overview and picks out the elements which he considers to be viable and credible and useful, and argues against those which he considers to be non-viable. And so that's what we see going on here. So hence practical human excellence. The human excellence bit is really the virtues, and I'll come to that. I don't want to anticipate too much out of a sequence in terms of what I'm going to present here over the course of this video lecture. So let's move on. Let's get some basics for Aristotle. So here's one of these depictions, statue depictions of Aristotle. Again, it can be hard to distinguish these old Greek guys. They all look much the same after a while. You can see his dates here. So he's firmly in the 4th century BCE, born on or around 384, and then dying on or around 322 BCE. So you can see he didn't live particularly long. He dies at the age of 62. But he saw quite a lot in his lifetime. He was a Macedonian aristocrat, studied with Plato, as I've mentioned before, probably from around the age of 20 through to around the age of 40. So really arriving in Athens, studying with Plato, presumably at the academy, as a very young man, almost, you could say as a sort of typical college age student, coming to Plato, coming from Macedonia. So not only a different city, but an entirely different region in Thrace, so to the northeast of the Peloponnese, but well connected. His father was a physician, and was physician to the royal family in Macedonia. So a well-connected individual. and presumably an intellectually ambitious individual who comes to Athens and studies with Plato. And we have to presume, based on what we know of his writings and his reputation, rapidly became Plato's star student and acolyte and follower. And again, we can only suppose that in that 20 years, two things went on. On the one hand, there would have been many face-to-face discussions between Aristotle and Plato and Plato's other students and followers, in which Aristotle was absolutely steeped in the Platonic perspective and the Platonic teachings of the time. But also gradually, we have to again presume he came to set out a critique of many of the Platonic doctrines. And we don't know whether there was ultimately a rivalry between the two men. We do know that Aristotle went on to found his own school, and we also know some other facts about Aristotle's life. Tensions between Athens and Macedonia, as Macedonia was a rising power. And certainly Aristotle was in exile a series at different points in his lifetime. What that says about the relationship between the figures of Plato and Aristotle is speculative. However, we can look at more recent intellectual history. I'm thinking, for example, the relationship between Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung in the early 20th century. And we could suppose a sort of similar situation where the younger man, at first, as it were, a loyal follower of the older foundational figure, and then gradually, there are intellectual differences, and then to some degree, tension and strife between the two of them, as the younger man sort of tries to sketch out his own theory and make his own way. So, that wouldn't be an entirely fanciful thing, but it's all speculation. So I've mentioned Aristotle in the middle years of his life, very much like Plato, founded a school, the Lyceum, in a somewhat different area to where Plato's academy was founded, but like Plato's academy, outside the city walls, in what would be a more sort of rural setting. So Aristotle did go on to found his own school. And there was a head of that school following Aristotle, and then a long line of heads of the Aristotelian school, just as there were people who headed up the Platonic academy as well. So this idea of a legacy that passes on from Aristotle through the immediate person that he handed over to, and then beyond. One of the stock differences that's historically observed between the two, between Plato and Aristotle, is that Aristotle is more of an empiricist, in the sense that direct observations of the natural world were considered to be a very important element of exploration and thinking. Again, I'm probably going to make this reminder many, many times over these different lectures, but whilst we see these figures as philosophers in the pursuit of philosophia, we have to bear in mind that philosophy is not what it is today, which is to say a specific discipline in the humanities. This is simply philosophy. We might just call it science at this point in time. Therefore, the range of topics, particularly in Aristotle, that we find runs the gamut of what we would consider today to be scientific disciplines. So zoology, botany, biology, physiology, all of these things, which would certainly not crop up directly as parts of philosophy, are very important elements in what Aristotle studied. And we have treatises on these different areas on plants and animals and various elements of nature. Now, talking about Aristotle's texts, what's very peculiar and in some ways very fascinating about the text that we have from Aristotle is that then, unlike Plato's texts, these are not texts that were meant for publication. According to ancient sources, such as Diogenes Laertius, Aristotle, like Plato, published hundreds and hundreds of books. However, we have no books whatever from Aristotle. That is to say, none of the texts that he intended to be published and that were published and read at the time. So you might be asking, well, how do we know anything, and what are these texts from Aristotle? And the answer to that is they're essentially lecture notes, and they were recovered in the Roman period almost by accident. Seemingly, they've been stored and essentially ended up in a marketplace of some kind, and were purchased and then reconstructed, and eventually they were published. And then, beyond the Roman period, again, they somewhat disappear, and then they're not resurrected until the Middle Ages, when they're translated into Arabic in Muslim Spain at the time, in the Middle Ages. And then through Arabic, they're translated into Latin, have a huge impact on, for example, the works of Aquinas, setting out Catholic theology at the time. And that's how they come back into, ultimately, into modern European languages. So you can see here there's a very complicated history, textual history. First of all, these are lecture notes, so they don't have the finish of a published work. They don't have any of the literary elements of, for example, Plato's dialogues. They're very stripped down sort of texts, much more technical texts, which is what you would expect if these are lecture notes, essentially, from Aristotle. We do find Aristotle seemingly pointing to illustrations, presumably what he was showing students at the time. But they're much harder going, depending on your taste, they're much harder going and much more open to interpretation, or certainly more difficult to penetrate often than Plato's text. But even the texts that we do have, as I mentioned before, have incredibly varied subject matters. So certainly there's a long text, a long series of lecture notes on nature, physis in Greek, on the physical world, on the soul, perisouches, so on the life principle, soul, mind, somewhat interchangeable in Greek. So a kind of philosophy of mind, if you like. That's a pretty refined treatise that almost reads more like a book. We have very influential treatise on politics, on the polis, and on collective life. And we have many lectures on logic, and where Aristotle sets out all of the sort of the formal logical proofs and the so-called logical laws, non-contradiction, and so forth. Beyond that, we have treatises, as I said, on plants and animals, on movements, on meteorology, on the heavens, on the cosmos, the metaphysics, as it's called, originally just the book that appears after the physics, which is also a theology. An incredible diversity of writings from this one man. I mentioned a little bit about the political background. So, as I say, we know that Aristotle was in exile from Athens for a protracted period. He went to the eastern Aegean coast of modern day Turkey. He stayed for a time on Lesbos when where he made observations of the wildlife, the plants and the animals, and seemingly married a member, a sort of an aristocratic member of a sort of kingly family in the region of modern day Assos, which again is on the Aegean coast. So this was against the backdrop of the growth in stature of Alexander the Great explorer. And indeed, Aristotle was briefly the tutor of Alexander in his youth. Hard to speculate how much influence Aristotle had over Alexander, but again, that's the connection between Aristotle directly to the Macedonian royal family, which, as Athens' power was fading, we can imagine that having a high-profile Macedonian philosopher wasn't that well received in Athens at the time, and no doubt the political atmosphere became a little ugly, and so Aristotle's safety was perhaps at risk, which led to him seeking exile elsewhere. So much for the background. As I say, there's a long history of physical history, essentially, as to how these texts come down to us. I'd stress again that when we read these texts now in the 21st century in English, it's very important to appreciate how much translation has gone on in the last 2,300 years. And the history of the translations has had a huge impact on how Aristotle's teachings have been understood, and they've been used and understood in very different contexts. When we come to look at them now in this kind of a context, then we're looking at Aristotle's insights into ethics, into morality. But in the past, there would have been Aristotle was cited as a sort of philosophical authority for theological purposes. So Aristotle's been put to many different uses. There's also this very complex history from Greek, Latin, Arabic, modern European languages, Italian, German, French, English. And as someone who studied Aristotle quite closely, and has been lucky enough to study Aristotle's writings in the reconstructed Greek text, I could say from firsthand that there's a lot of openness to ways of reading Aristotle. So arguably we'll never have the definitive text, and there's always room for interpretation in terms of what's going on. We're trying to come up with a sort of theory of best fit in terms of what Aristotle's teachings actually are. So just a kind of reminder about the complexity of the text that we're dealing with. And also there's a warning there as to, when you read Aristotle, don't get carried away thinking, well, that's what he must mean. Always, question yourself a little bit and say, well, that's what he might mean, but let's keep that for now and go on with the text and see if that pans out as I explore the text further. So the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics, as I've mentioned, is really a kind of meta-ethical theory. But the first thing that Aristotle lays down is something we've already encountered, which is that the purpose of human life is the pursuit of happiness. And happiness is, there are many claims to the means to happiness, or the way to become happy or to have a flourishing life. And Aristotle's pretty quick to reject. Well, he considers, but then rejects, in a sense, the commonly held ideas about what the means to happiness are. So, an obvious one would be money, having material wealth. That's rejected because it's too precarious. I touched on this in the previous video lecture. Money comes and goes, possessions come and go. You don't really want to, you may get sort of transitory satisfaction from money, but it's not permanent enough to be a reliable means to happiness. Social esteem as well, how you seem to others, how much kudos you have, if you like, in the community. Again, that's a good thing. I mean, neither money nor reputation are bad things for Aristotle, obviously, but they're insecure. People can turn against you. Look at the life of the politician, for example. Approval ratings come and go, and one minute you're, everyone loves you, and the next minute everyone kind of hates you. Or we think of the life of celebrities as well, very similar kind of thing. And then finally, almost inevitably, the life of pleasure, hedonistic life. And again, our pleasures are seen as precarious because not only is there this law of diminishing returns, but also the sources of pleasure may, like any material goods, disappear. And so there isn't that reliability. And that sense of precariousness is really why all of these things are not ultimately seen as the efficient means for achieving happiness. Now, Aristotle has this definition of happiness that he comes back to time and again. And the translation of the Greek phrase that he uses for this is that happiness is a rational activity of the soul in accord with virtue. So, that's a fairly complicated formula. Try to kind of break down some of that in the next slide. But the definition again is a rational activity of the soul in accord with virtue. So what does that mean? Let's break this down. So first of all, to underscore the fact that it's kind of a given for Aristotle that the purpose of human life is the attainment of happiness. And you might think, well, okay, as a psychological statement, is that true? Does everybody want to be happy? You might know individuals who seem to, for example, revel in unhappiness or almost seek out unhappiness and sort of chaos and so forth. I think what Aristotle would say to, in those instances is that, well, people might be very effective at, in a sense, not being happy. And they might be, in a sense, the authors of their own misfortune, but ultimately that's not what they want. Whilst someone else might judge them as, almost being addicted to unhappiness or something, or misery or chaos, as I say, ultimately they're striving for happiness. They're just not selecting the right means to get happy, as it were, or to attain happiness. So that's kind of what he would say to that. There are, Aristotle does have this idea that there is perhaps a subset of individuals who are not equipped for happiness. Someone with acute mental illness or so forth. Again, as we would recognize in our own contexts, people who perhaps suffer from chronic depression and so forth, or whatever the threshold is, right? And so he acknowledges that there might be, certain individuals for whom happiness is, in a sense, unattainable. But on the whole, for Aristotle, happiness is a given as the goal of human existence. I've anticipated this before, but just to reiterate that unlike Plato, Aristotle thinks that ethics is not really a matter of setting out a theory as such. Really, what Aristotle's ethics looks like is more of a manual for how to best pursue happiness. It's almost like a self-help manual, albeit a very complicated one. But for Aristotle, it's really, you know, what do I need to do to become happy, right? And you can give people nudges and you can kind of, you know, steer them in the right direction. But it's not, you know, the means to happiness is not a theory, is not gaining the theory as such, right? I often like to say that, you know, Aristotle looks at the human being just as he would look at any other species. And he looks at the different sort of component parts, and he sort of observes the human animal, and then comes up with some general observations. For Aristotle, just like any other species, whether a plant or an animal, there are certain ways and certain conditions under which the human animal flourishes. So he almost has this sort of, you know, scientific, observational, almost sort of distanced perspective on the human being as a certain species, if you like, that has its own idiosyncrasies and has its own ways of flourishing, just like an ant or an ape or a particular type of flower has optimal conditions. He almost sees the human condition in that sort of a light, sort of analogous to other species. And you know, along with that sort of naturalistic sort of tendency, that sort of empirical tendency in Aristotle, Aristotle seems very opposed to the idea that there's, you know, there's some sort of otherworldly knowledge, some sort of quest for an insight into the good, that is really what ethics should be all about. You know, if we think again briefly of Plato's allegory of the cave, you know, that's his sort of mini picture of the human quest for knowledge, but also that final thing that the escaped prisoner looks at is the sun, and that's meant to be, according to Plato, the form of the good. So in Plato, there's this idea that the point of the human condition is to arrive at the startling revelation into the good. And Aristotle rejects essentially that whole picture and says, no, you know, ethics is about doing well in worldly social conditions, by which he doesn't mean, you know, advancing in a sort of worldly social political way, but he just means, you know, if I want to understand the best way to live, then, you know, I have to keep my feet on the ground and kind of look at this under the actual social conditions that are given to me. And I shouldn't sort of go on these sort of fanciful quests after otherworldly knowledge. That's not going to be the way to pursue the good life. That said, Aristotle does acknowledge that there are two, if you like, paradigms of knowledge or wisdom, one of which is practical. You know, the word practical comes from is a Greek word, ultimately relates to pragmata, the things, the usable things, as opposed to theoretical wisdom. And again, you know, theory, theoria, is a Greek word meaning sort of speculation, to sort of view things from afar. It's etymologically connected, for example, to the word theater, which is a viewing space. And ethics is primarily about practical wisdom, which in Greek is called phronesis, as translated into Latin as prudentia, prudence. And that literally means looking ahead. It's foresight, providence, prudence. It's foresight, and, you know, being mindful of things, but in a practical sense, theoretical wisdom is, in a sense, pure philosophy. And so Aristotle draws a distinction between practical philosophy, which is knowing how to live well, the quest in ethics, and theoretical philosophy, theoretical wisdom, which is really to do with ultimately with metaphysics and those type of speculations. And he draws a pretty hard line between those two things. And that's, I think, at the heart of the quarrel with Plato. In order to live well, I don't need to, as it were, indulge in metaphysics. So we saw that Aristotle's definition of happiness is a rational activity of the soul in accordance or in accord with virtue. So what of reason? The Greek word here is nous, and allied with that is logos. And logos is a word that has an extraordinarily wide meaning in ancient Greek. It is translated into Latin as ratio, which then becomes our rational and reason. But logos or logos in Greek can mean a lot of different things. It can mean an account, for example. It can mean a statement, a proposition in more modern philosophical language. It can mean proportion. It can mean an awful lot of different things. When Aristotle uses the term in accord, a rational activity of the soul, in this case, he's really referring to using, what we might call the sort of, the intellectual powers of the human being, the element which discerns correctly. This really refers back to a theory of mind, which much of which had already been set out by his teacher Plato. Aristotle does have a sort of definition of the human being, where he says that the human being is rational desire, or desiring rationally. Desire for Aristotle, the Greek term is orexis. Desire is what propels a human agent to do something. And reason is what helps them discern the best ways to satisfy the desire. So think of a simple example. Let's say, I feel hunger pangs. So something in my body is telling me that, it's time for lunch or whatever. And that is the thing that propels me to, as it were, act in the world, to go out and try to find the means or find some means to satisfy the desire, in this case, hunger. But hopefully, I'm not just going to eat any old thing. I'm not going to start, chewing on my wallet or eating my own shoes or, nibbling on some wallpaper or something, right? I guess I could do that if I was having a bad day. But hopefully, I'll find something that's a little bit more digestible and tasty and, likely to have a good nutritional benefit. And that's where, to put it very simplistically, that's where the reason bit comes in. Reason, and it's something that we also learn through experience, of course. But the reason bit will steer me towards the best means to satisfying the desire. Because, ultimately, certainly from Aristotle's perspective, everything that a human being does, more or less, is purposive. So it has an end, so-called telos. So what reason does is it helps me discern what the best means are to get the best end result. Desire in and of itself isn't equipped to do that. So similarly in ethics, when he says it's a rational activity, what that means in Aristotelian language is that I'm using that power of discernment, or that power of discernment is active in me, to ascertain, to determine the best means to what? Well, to ultimately to becoming happy, to flourish as a human being. So that's really the force, that's the meaning of rational in terms of rational activity. And the fact that it's an activity itself is important. It's, Aristotle talks about this as well. Happiness could be considered a state, if you like, perhaps an end state, for example. But Aristotle doesn't see it that way. Happiness is the going on of something, the activity. I'm in an active mode. So what's interesting, I think, about this is that it's a depiction of happiness as a kind of process, as an ongoing process. It's not a fixed state or an end result. I mean, happiness is the end to which I move. But the way that he actually depicts it, it's more like an ongoing activity, which I think is a kind of an intriguing notion, right? I think this comes out as well when Aristotle asks, well, can I, in a sense, cease to be happy, even though if I've led a good life, if, for example, my reputation is ruined after I'm dead, or terrible things happen to my family after I'm dead. The idea being, well, is happiness a culminating point? Is all of my life, as it were, just trying to get there, and then hopefully I get over the finishing line, and then all is good, right? But in a strict sense, once I'm dead, there's no question of happiness anymore, because there's no activity of the soul. One thing more to say about this thing logos is that Aristotle attributes it as a unique property of the human species. This has a long and checkered and somewhat notorious history, in the sense that just as in contemporary animal studies, you say, well, there's something unique here to do with the human species that no other animal possesses, and that can be seen in the words of the contemporary Australian philosopher Peter Singer as a kind of speciesism, that the sort of rational capacity of the human being, which is not to be found in anything else. And the roots of that notion, to a great extent, could be found in Aristotle. Now, it's a rational activity of the soul. So what's the soul doing here, and how do we to understand this? Well, the Greek, it should state that if this is the translation of the Latin term anima, that's the Latin term. The Greek term is psyche, from which we get psychology and psyche, as we would say it. That's the living principle. And soul is unlike logos, if logos is specific and unique to the human. Psyche, or soul, certainly isn't. In fact, even plants have a version of soul, because soul is just the Greek word for the principle of life. Anything that can grow, take in nutrients, any form of biological life has soul. That said, there are different, as it were, there's a kind of hierarchical sense of different forms of soul. So there's, so-called vegetative soul, which, simply has the capacity to take in nutrients and grow. Animal life as such, from the term anima, the Latin term for soul, has the additional obvious capacity for movement. Animals can move from one place to the next in the way that, at least for the individual plant, is not possible. And plants can kind of move around and look for nutrients in the soil, and obviously they grow above ground and seek out light and so forth. But that capacity for locomotion is an obvious characteristic feature of the animal. So soul is a very broad term. It doesn't have any religious connotations. It's simply a neutral term signifying the principle of life. So it's very important to not to read into what Aristotle's saying when he's saying, well, happiness, morality has to do with an activity of the soul. Of course, subsequently that was interpreted in religious ways, as I mentioned, particularly through the incorporation of Aristotelian teaching into Catholic theology. But in its original sense, it has no religious connotations whatever. So if we kind of put all this together, then we could say that the human being has a unique rational power of the soul. Again, it's the rational soul that's at work in the attainment of human happiness for Aristotle. So in accord with virtue, so very important to say something about virtue. And I've touched on this before in a previous video lecture, but obviously this is the place to get into this in more detail. So the term virtue, again, is very bogged down for us, typically in a sort of religious feeling to it. If we call someone virtuous in sort of contemporary English, it's usually meant in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way. We don't naturally use the language, I think, in everyday English of virtues and vices, right? It has an old-fashioned kind of feel to it. And typically, when I teach in the classroom, I ask folks to say, well, do a little exercise, a small group exercise or whatever, and share with the rest of the group what you think some of your personal character virtues are. And typically people come up with things like, I'm patient, I'm kind, and so on and so forth. These are, more or less, whether consciously understood or not, these are more or less kind of Christian virtues as understood from that tradition. They're mostly to do with putting up with things rather than doing things. And that sort of steers us in the wrong direction for understanding Aristotelian virtue, because Aristotelian virtues are better described as powers to do things which others will recognize as skills, essentially. So you might better translate the Greek term as skill. And that Greek term is arete. In ancient Greek, unlike English, there are no silent vowels. So wherever you see a vowel, it's pronounced in its own right. So arete, sometimes translated as excellence, and it certainly isn't limited to moral attributes. Aristotle gives various examples, one of which is, that a knife has the arete, the skill, the property, the excellence of being sharp and being able to cut well. So, you really have to think of virtue here, not so much as a sort of internalized attitude to something, such as, patience, perseverance, and so forth. Perseverance can certainly show up as an Aristotelian virtue, but it's not so much a mental attitude. It's not something, virtues are not things that people carry around in their heads. They're not like aptitudes in that sense, they're demonstrated excellences, demonstrated skills. So, a good way to think about an Aristotelian virtue is as a sort of proficiency. So, again, when I'm in class, one of the examples I tend to give is that, let's say somebody tells you, I'm a great guitar player. In other words, they possess the virtue or the skill of playing the guitar well. Well, you might take their word for it, but you might, hand them a guitar and say, well, okay, well, let's see it then. And it'll be very obvious to any observer whether they can play the guitar or not. And that wouldn't require you yourself to be able to play the guitar well, but you'd know by how well they can manipulate the instrument. Or equally, let's say somebody boasts, that they're a great marathon runner, but it turns out that they can't run 200 yards. Um, these not only are these things skills, but they're externally provable skills, and that's the important thing. They can be socially validated. So again, virtue, the Christian doctrine of virtue is much more a kind of internalized thing. I mean, how do you prove, for example, that somebody's patient or kind? Sure, someone can demonstrate those skills, but they're more, I would argue, to do with the sort of the rapport, the sort of the mental attitude that somebody has towards something. After all, you might think somebody's super patient, but actually maybe they're actually, super impatient inside, right? They're just putting a good face on it. You could have a doubt about that. You couldn't really have a doubt about whether someone can run a marathon or not, because they can either do it or they cannot. And there's no kind of middle ground. If somebody collapses after 200 yards, then clearly they can't run a marathon. Or if somebody tells you they're an ace guitar player, but they can't even strum 3 chords, then clearly they don't have the skill that they're claiming they have. And we don't have to kind of second guess about this, as we would perhaps in some of the more sort of Christian type virtues. So Aristotle, constructs this theory of virtues, and I should say, he has a definition of happiness here, as a rational activity of the soul in accord with virtue. And the virtues, the best way, I think, to understand the virtues in Aristotle's ethical theory is that the virtues are the primary means which we need to cultivate in order to become happy and to attain happiness and to have a flourishing life. So the end of human life, the purpose of human life, is set. It's not open to debate, according to Aristotle. It's happiness, eudaimonia, flourishing. So what it is we have to work out in sort of ethical theory is, what are the most efficient means to become happy, or what are the essential means that we need to attain in order to become happy? And that's what the virtues are. They're the means to happiness. Okay. Now, Aristotle has this kind of interesting argument that essentially the happiest human being would be essentially that person who is best at being a human. Right? And that's, well, you might think, well, that's kind of circular, right? It's like, well, the happiest human is the best human. Sure, but what is the best human? Well, again, this kind of goes back, I think, to what I was saying earlier about Aristotle thinking about the human being as, in a sense, it's almost sort of, he has a sort of comparative species perspective on this, right? Because he could say, well, for example, if he studies bees, right? And, bees are social creatures like we are. And once you've looked at the properties of a particular species, you can say, well, this is what an optimal bee is, right? Or an oak tree, or a certain type of fish, right? I mean, this is what this species looks like when it's optimally flourishing. And he has more or less that take on the human condition. So to be a happy human being is to be the best human being you can be. But then he has a generic definition as to what a human being is. And that's where it comes back to reason. Because again, recall that reason for Aristotle is the uniquely human power. So excellence, the excellent human being will be the human being who cultivates their reason in an optimal way. And that, the description of the human being as a rational agent is at one and the same time a prescription. And in modern philosophy, we have this thing called the is-ought distinction that was brought in by the Scottish 18th century philosopher David Hume. And Hume argued that, well, you can't extrapolate from an is to an ought, in the sense that if you describe something as being so and so, that doesn't tell you anything about what they should do, right? Well, Aristotelian thinking doesn't work that way. Once you've gained an insight into what something is, you can then extrapolate into statements of what they ought to do. So this is exactly how this pans out in Aristotle's thinking. So cultivating reason is really what we need to do. So speaking of virtue, Aristotle has a kind of a sort of general distinction between two different kinds of virtue. There are virtues of character, and we'll see examples of those, and we're really just going to focus on those for the purpose of this class. Examples of those would be courage, honesty, generosity. Right? That's one set. Those are the type of character traits that we can cultivate through practice and turn them into habits. But there's a whole other subset of virtues that Aristotle refers to as intellectual virtues. And the primary intellectual virtues, which I've already touched on, are prudence, phronesis in Greek, and wisdom, practical wisdom and theoretical wisdom. And theoretical wisdom is Sophia, right? Which is what philosophers ultimately pursue. Right? So that's the nature of virtue, and those are the two generic types of virtue. I want to move on to book 2 briefly, and then I'll touch even more briefly on book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics. So in book 2, Aristotle, he doesn't give us a sort of tabulated form like this. He probably did have something like a tabulated form that he offered to his students, something that he sort of displayed. And there's a lot to this. I'm not going to be able to get through all of this, so I'll just touch on some examples. But it will give you more concrete detail. I guess the important thing to point out here is that Aristotle thinks of virtue as a mean, as a midpoint, as a balance point between an excess and a deficiency. And this is a very important schema that he imposes on all of this. It's the so-called golden mean. Right? So the first two virtues that are given here are arguably what we might call cardinal virtues. They're sort of foundational for everything else. And I think there's different reasons for this. I think they're cardinal in one sense because they're the first virtues that, as somebody grows, they need to attain in order to set out on the right path to becoming an excellent human being. Let's take the latter of the two first, namely temperance. That's a traditional title for it. It also has a sort of antiquated feel to it, temperance societies and so forth. Temperance really means sort of balance in this context, right? In distinction from temperance, there's, what here is translated as self-indulgence. So a self-indulgent person would be someone who is, given to pursuing pleasures excessively and equally avoiding pain at all costs. So, just to give you an example of this in terms of human development, very young kids, I have 2 young kids, are very averse to pain. We are all averse to pain, but as we get older, we kind of put up with it So obvious example would be, when you're a young kid, you get taken for a lot of vaccinations and shots. And, everybody knows little kids absolutely hate this, right? They can't stand it, even though, the typically, the people who administer the vaccinations, they're very skillful, and it takes less than a second to administer. But I know, from firsthand experience that, once you tell a kid that they're going for a shot, they're going to agonize over it potentially for days, certainly for hours, and we'll make a huge fuss. And you have to try all of these ways to get the kid to put up with the fact that they're going to have to do this thing. Um, uh, and you try to induce, you give them inducements and sort of bribes essentially, and you say, well, I'll take you for an ice cream afterwards, or very little kids, in a way, that's not a problem. I mean, babies, they don't see it coming, so they can't anticipate it, but toddlers can anticipate it. So the point in this context is that tolerance of pain is something that people have to learn, and it's not that you're teaching people that pain is a good thing. You're teaching them that a short-term discomfort is preferable to what might turn out to be something way worse. But there's a certain psychological development that has to occur, and that's part of the the maturation process. So that by the time kids get to a certain age, they can rationalize that, and they can see that, well, okay, this isn't a great thing, but I can put up with it. And then, as we get older, whatever, we'll put up with, dentists drilling our teeth out and all kinds of awful things, just because, we can tell ourselves, well, all of this is unpleasant, but it's still better in the long run. And then equally with pleasures. So again, not to run kids down or whatever, right? But, a certain, what you have to do in helping kids is you have to get them to moderate their pleasures. For example, you're not going to give, hopefully, you're not going to give a kid a whole birthday cake, as much as they might want to like dig in and do that, because obviously it's going to have adverse consequences. Now, in saying all of this, everybody is different. And again, as a dad, I know that I have two daughters, and they have different tendencies, and so different pleasures will be attractive to different people, and Aristotle recognized this too, that certain people are inclined to overindulgence. More rarely, people are, in a sense, too little given to pursuing pleasures and avoiding pain, and that in itself can be a problem, because the pursuit of pleasure for Aristotle is not a problem in and of itself. In fact, pleasures are important because they motivate. If I go back to what I was talking about earlier with this sort of desire and reason, sort of duality being at work, if we don't desire anything, we're not actually going to do anything. According to Aristotle, desire is the actual vehicle of human agency. But so rarely, there are some people who are, in a sense, almost Zen-like disinclination to pursue pleasure. But that, interestingly, if taken to an extreme, is not virtuous. It's always the balance point that is the virtue for Aristotle. To come then to the other, what we might call the other cardinal virtue of courage. Now, the term in Greek here is andrea, which is derived from the Greek term for male, andros. So courage, literally translated in Greek is manliness. Whereas temperance relates to pleasures and pains, courage relates to fear and confidence. And, those two things are kind of closely connected. Again, when I was giving the example of, a toddler getting a shot, you can encourage them to be strong and to be courageous and so forth, right? And Aristotle would say, that's an important element of early moral education. Learning how to put your fears into proportion is part of growing up, right? And so, both of these things, the sort of modulation of pleasure and the modulation of fear, these things are important, so that human beings can kind of function, and that they can take the measure of what is a genuine threat, as opposed to, becoming overly anxious about something that's not actually a threat. So, one of the reasons I think why these are sort of cardinal virtues is this is where moral education begins, right? There are many other virtues here that are set out to do with, and to some extent they relate back to, the different contenders for the good life. So to do with money, to do with social esteem, and so forth. And then some of them are about emotional regulation, for example, to do with anger. And we'll pick this up again when we look at the Stoic teaching around things like anger. But Aristotle always goes for the middle way, as it were, right? It's not about never being angry. So he doesn't demonize anger. The Greek term for anger is orge. He doesn't demonize anger, but it really becomes about, righteous indignation. Sometimes we should feel anger, particularly in the face of injustice. But so, there is an excess, which is a lack of spiritedness, which is really about how, sometimes I should feel indignant about the wrong thing happening, right? We think of protests or justice movements and so forth, right? So there's no demonization of anger here. There is, as we'll see, the Stoics go on to say, well, anger is always a bad emotion to allow into your system, as it were, right? And there are contemporary psychological theories that promote that idea that anger is always toxic, essentially. But that's not where Aristotle stands. So a lack of spiritedness is itself a kind of a vice, right? Whereas, if you're getting angry all the time, as it's translated here, irascibility, that's not virtuous, right? I mean, it's all about proportion. One of the catchphrases, if you like, one of these sort of mantras that we find in Aristotle's text is, a virtue is doing the right thing in the right way to the right person at the right time to the right degree, right? So all of the virtues, that's an important point to add in, all of the virtues are situational. Okay, it's sort of, what does the situation call for? The virtue itself is a disposition, a skill, an ability to do something or to feel something. But the key thing is in the moral life and the deployment of virtue. In other words, how do I exhibit that skill? How do I use that skill? How do I put it into practice in the right way? So you can see, there's more to it here. Some of these are social in nature. Some of these are to do with, as I said, the getting and spending of money. And I think this gives us a clue, an important clue, again, as to how Aristotle's thinking about morality. Morality is not something that is somehow a set of attributes within me that I know myself through introspection. All of these virtues are skills that I exhibit in a social setting to and with others. So the moral life is a life lived with and in the presence of others. I think that's a very important point to add in. So to say a little bit more about happiness and pleasure, similarly to Plato here, I think there's quite a bit of overlap. Aristotle says that the beginning of morality, of becoming moral, of attaining virtue, is the ability to control our search for pleasure, right? The virtue here is sophrosyne, which literally means kind of, that you're mindful. There is a contemporary doctrine of mindfulness. Perhaps, this is a precursor of that. But really, it's really about moderation, right? Not eradicating the desire for pleasure, but moderating it and making sure that it doesn't become self-destructive. We'll recall when I was talking about Plato in a previous video lecture that, when pleasure really runs amok, then you have this figure of the tyrant who in a sense can do anything and everything, but kind of loses themselves into the process. Aristotle has, I think, a similar psychology to this, albeit it's a little bit less flowery and a little bit more down to earth. So there's also a question, I think, of, not only the degree in which pleasure is pursued, but the right type of pleasures. So that's where the discernment process comes into play, right? How do I steer myself towards the right pleasures? And, whether it's in terms of, for example, thinking of a child, what they pick up from the world around them or informal learning, in some ways you're trying to help the child to steer them towards the right sources of satisfaction. And that's kind of the key thing, right? If we go through early life attaching gratification to the wrong type of thing, to sort of self-destructive things, it'll be extremely difficult then to change those sort of habits of mind and those inclinations in later life. That's another reason why fixing this, as it were, at the beginning is so important, because it sets the path for future life. So as I've mentioned, the idea here of moderation or temperance it's a translation of the Greek term sophrozoune, which really has to do with self-restraint, restraining oneself and sort of being mindfully moderate, if you will. So again, in sum, Aristotle's position on pleasure, even more so than Plato's, is not an ascetic position. He doesn't condemn pleasure. Again, there's more traces of that, arguably, in Christian doctrine, certainly, than there is in ancient Greek thinking. Pleasure is seen as fine. It's all about moderation. So I've anticipated this as well, which is the sort of the doctrine of the golden mean, that really, again, it's a question of moderation. But there's a question that arises that Aristotle tackles, which is that, well, so we're going to conceive of the virtues as this sort of midpoint between excess and deficiency. So does that mean then that, my virtue is your virtue and these are one and the same thing? So does courage, in other words, does courage in my case, is that identical to courage in anyone else's case? And the answer to that is, interestingly, no. That actually, even though there might be what Wittgenstein called a family resemblance, so, my courage might have something in common with your courage and a third person's courage, it's not identical. That actually it's specifically different. So, there's a question here, arguably, of moral relativism relative to moral universalism. And I think it's fair to say that Plato was certainly a proponent of moral universalism, because for Plato, again, morality is ultimately about insights, and the insights relate to these things that Plato calls ideas or forms, and these things are unchanging. So to have an insight into the form of the good must be identical for everyone who gains that moral insight. Whereas for Aristotle, the guiding lights of moral life are morally excellent individuals. So, this is again Aristotle's opposition to an otherworldly source of moral guidance. For Plato, it seems that, to become morally good, you need to have this very in-depth and rather introspective, speculative quest for knowledge of kind of otherworldly kind. Whereas for Aristotle, it's much more mundane. If you want guides to moral life, if you want foundations for moral life, you really have to look around you and say, well, who are the people that exhibit these virtues to the greatest degree of excellence for me? And then effectively you kind of emulate those individuals and you act like those individuals until you yourself then embody those virtues. And so it's a much more socially oriented process. Although it's often pointed out that there's a circularity to this logic, right? That, well, how do you know? How do you decide that the virtue is exhibited in those people? I mean, you elect, as it were, your moral leaders, but on what basis do you do that? You must have some knowledge to guide you in order to do that. So, there's a kind of Platonic objection to this idea that what guides us are the morally exemplary individuals that we find around us. But how do we recognize who a morally exemplary individual is in the first place? So finally, and briefly, because we're going to say more about this, or I'm going to discuss more about this in the next video lecture about free will and determinism and fate. But I want to touch on, as a kind of a way of transitioning, Aristotle's, very briefly, on Aristotle's teaching in the third book on Nicomachean Ethics about free choice. And there's more on this in the Canvas module, because I put these brief notes for both books 1 and 3 from the Nicomachean Ethics. So I encourage you to look at that. It's just a Word document, but where I sort of break down some of the important moves in book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics. So big picture for Aristotle, there are 3 types of causes, aitiai in Greek. There are natural causes, there's human choice, and then there's chance, touche in Greek. And the sphere of choice for Aristotle is restricted by these other 2 spheres. So, I think what Aristotle is getting at in all of this is that, well, imagine an individual given, placed in an ethical dilemma, right? Let's I've mentioned him before. Let's take one of Peter Singer's famous examples of, rescuing a child who's seemingly drowning in a pond or something, right? You might have lots of excuses for not doing that, but equally, you might have lots of physical constraints. So let's say, it's a pretty deep pond and you can't swim. Well, that's a constraint. I mean, that's not really a choice then that you can plausibly make, not unless you want to drown along with the child, and that wouldn't make any sense. Or, let's say something else constrains you for whatever reason. These would all be, in a sense, the limitations, the physical limitations of the situation. None of this is under you, within your capacity to choose. And equally, chance. It seems strange to perhaps talk about chance in the moral life, but again, going back to the example, most people are not going to happen upon the child that's seemingly about to drown in the pond. It's just chance that brought you there, and Aristotle acknowledges that element, and that's important, I think, because I think what Aristotle's getting at with including chance is that nobody can guarantee that they attain happiness. Things happen, so that the person that leads the very best life that they could have led may nevertheless fall short of happiness through no fault of their own, but just because of the random chance of events. So narrowing it down to things that are chosen, Aristotle places 3 conditions on something that's genuinely chosen. One is that it was intentional. So what that means is that, I actually intended to do it. It was purposive. It wasn't just done randomly, right? Think of an example, whatever, let's say, you've never played golf before, and you happen to, hit the ball with a club, and you get a hole in one or something, right? Very unlikely, right? But you didn't intend to do it, so that makes a difference. It wasn't purposive in that sense. Similar to this, that it's done sort of knowingly. What Aristotle means by that is that you understood the situation. So similar, that would be another feature of the example, the sort of silly example I just gave. You didn't really know what you were doing, so you didn't have the technical know-how, and in that sense, again, you can't really ascribe intentionality, and therefore you can't say that that person was truly responsible for what they did. And finally, the final condition is that something was done for its own sake, that it was an end in itself, that it wasn't done simply for the reason of, for the purpose of something else. And if all of these conditions are met, then you can say that something was truly chosen. Right? And that's really, choice is really the mode in which the moral life is lived, right? So those are all things which you can say were freely done, because this is an examination of free choice. The contrary notion to this is something done from compulsion. So if something is compelled, then its agent is an external cause, external force, something outside of the agent themselves. Another element to compulsion is that there was some kind of ignorance of the consequences. So that is the complementary idea to something that was unknowingly, right? So you knew what you were about, and you did it in such a way. And another form of the compulsory, which is referred to in the text as non-voluntary, is when we do something to avoid something else. So the underlying kind of teaching is, of Aristotle, is that freedom of choice is crucial to the moral life. That if we deny radically that there's a freedom of choice, then we can't really hold people responsible for what they do, and therefore we can't reward or punish them because they didn't have any control over what was done. And Aristotle doesn't believe that's compatible with an accurate account of the moral life. I wanted to say something briefly before closing about this third element of something is compulsory when it's done to avoid another evil. So thankfully, in his lecture notes, Aristotle gives us an example of this type of involuntary act or non-voluntary. So he gives the example of a ship's captain. Greece and Athens in particular, these are maritime city-states, so they did a lot of trading in the Eastern Mediterranean. So, it's an example that would appeal to his audience and would be sort of close to hand in terms of something they could recognize. So suppose we have a ship's captain that sets off on a voyage and then runs into an unexpected storm. And the dilemma that the captain is faced with is whether he can either throw his cargo overboard and thereby give his ship a better chance of surviving the storm and not sinking, or he can, as it were, stick with the mission, which is to bring the cargo to the other port, but risk the whole ship going down with not only the loss of the cargo, but loss of potentially of all life on board. And so let's further suppose that the captain makes the former decision and decides to jettison the cargo. Now, and then the question would be, well, did the captain choose this? Was there a free choice involved? And Aristotle would say, strictly speaking, no, it's not a free choice, because it's counter to the purpose of the voyage, right? and it wasn't done for its own sake. Look at that, right? The captain, under normal circumstances, would never have chosen to throw his cargo overboard, for the simple reason that the purpose of the voyage was to bring the cargo to the port. But they were compelled to do it, but not in a sort of an absolute sense, right? Nobody, it wasn't that there was a mutiny among the crew, and then they held a sword to the captain and obliged him to throw it all overboard. He did, in some sense, have a choice. So it wasn't compulsory in a hard sense, but he decided that was the better way forward. But interestingly, that's not a voluntary choice, because essentially, you could say, going back to the beginning here, something else has intervened, almost a kind of combination of natural circumstances brought on by chance. And these have sort of limited, then very, very severely limited, the freedom of choice of the captain. But he has to kind of come up with a slightly different word than involuntary. So it generally gets translated as non-voluntary, in the sense that it's not hard compulsion. He still has a choice. He could risk the ship going under and keep the cargo, and maybe he'll be lucky and maybe he won't. But he makes an informed choice and decides to throw the cargo overboard. But it's not, strictly speaking, voluntary in that sense, because it runs counter to the purpose of the voyage more generally, if that makes sense. So to wrap up, Aristotle sees ethics as really the attainment of virtue. Virtue is a skill, primarily character skills, which are acquired over time. The cardinal, what all the virtues rest on, is an ability to modulate pleasure and pain, to pursue the right pleasures and avoid the wrong ones, to deal with pain when that's necessary for a greater good. And also, the other cardinal virtue is courage, in the sense of dealing with fears and apprehensions and having a sort of proper economy of those. Aristotle further sees virtue as a kind of virtuous mean, a sort of balance point between excess and deficiency and all of these things. And then finally, for Aristotle, to be, properly speaking, an ethical agent is to activate and to put into action our power for free will. But the free will itself, the power to make voluntary choices, is about discerning with the restricting features of empirical conditions over which we have no control, but also chance events over which we equally have no control. But he doesn't reduce out the ability to choose simply because of chance and natural conditions. There's still a degree to which each of us can choose. Therefore, on that basis, we're responsible for our ability to pursue happiness and to discern the best means, and therefore the cultivation of virtue. So ultimately, the responsibility for my own happiness lies with me. So in the next videos, we'll be exploring some more features of the free will and fate debate. So I'll pick things up then.